I often like to joke that in a tech company, if the market is growing rapidly, you're pretty likely to be successful as a startup company. Everything else could be a failure, right? The product might not work or the marketing might not be on point, but if the market as a whole is growing, you're in a good place. Drug development is the exact opposite. You need hundreds of different things to all go right and for the stars align for that drug to get to patients. But if any one of them, from the stability to the supply chain, the mechanism of action to the regulatory authority, doesn't work, then unfortunately the drug is not going to proceed. So I think that's the facet that I'd say is really critical for people to understand is the multifaceted team sport that goes into drug development, but also that you need everything to work at the same time. And you just generally don't get a drug to move forward if that doesn't happen.
Today, I'm speaking with Alok Tayi. Alok is the founder of various biotech software companies, and most recently of Vibe Bio, a platform that invests in biotechs, specifically those that develop high-potential drugs for rare and overlooked diseases. In the past, Alok has worked as a scientist within Cornell, Northwestern, and Harvard, most notably with George Whitesides and Samuel Stubb. Among much else, Alok and I discuss legacy beliefs within the biopharma industry, the advantages of DAOs as an organizational structure, and the role and limits of AI in drug discovery. Without further ado, I hope you enjoy our conversation. So, Alok, thanks so much for being here today.
Yep, my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
To start off, what idea hooked you and led you to create Vibe?
Yeah, my background is as a scientist, and I also spent time building some of the early vertical SaaS companies, cloud software companies focused on pharma. But the idea that really led me to start Vibe was a personal experience I had a few years ago when my daughter was born. My daughter was born with two separate rare disorders that had no dedicated treatments. And even though we lived in Boston and had access to great medical care, as well as access to phenomenal pharmaceutical companies and investors in this space, we were particularly disappointed by the lack of treatments, as well as the lack of interest to fund those sorts of drug development programs. And so that's where the idea came to me that we needed a new approach by which we can actually bring capital and technology to the table to help fund the 10,000 plus rare diseases that are out there that affect kids like mine and others.
Mm-hmm. And correct me if I'm wrong, Vibe Bio primarily focuses on overlooked diseases. How much does that overlap with actual rare diseases? Because as I understand it, sometimes it's not just rare diseases that don't get funding, but rather, pretty common ones where maybe the economics just don't really align to make it viable for a biopharma company to develop a new drug. So what's the definition of a rare disease, and what are you actually formally focused on with Vibe?
Yeah. So for us, in terms of what we fund, we focus on primarily rare and overlooked diseases. Rare diseases in the US are defined as diseases that affect less than 200,000 patients within the United States. Overlooked is another area that I think has less of a definition and less metrics around it, but is important to us also in part because when we look at rare diseases specifically, there's a lot of great science that could potentially treat them. A lot of patients that suffer from those diseases, about 1 in 10 Americans suffer from a rare disease. But oftentimes the incentive structure, along with the decision-making biases within a pharmaceutical company or an investment team, leads them away from those diseases. I think similarly, and you can probably appreciate this from the DSI perspective, is that there are other areas like, say, women's health, which also are not necessarily rare. There are very large a number of patients within that space, but also are overlooked by the traditional industry. And so we see ourselves as helping to bring capital and technology to bear to help us identify and fund the best possible treatments within that space and demonstrate not only can you bring useful medicines to market and help patients, but also there's a decent economic opportunity there as well.
Yeah. What do you wish, maybe on a meta level, more people on the outside realized about your field? What's maybe the most underappreciated aspect of your field, or the most underexplored, perhaps to you, interesting idea?
There's so many areas. I think the two things I would just highlight maybe as a place to start the conversation would be that first, drug development is a team sport. You need expertise across clinical trials, manufacturing, biology, regulatory, etc., to all come together and collaborate in order to develop a drug. The consequence of that is you often have difficulty optimizing which drugs you end up funding and pursuing because it's such a complex and multifaceted problem in optimization. I often like to joke that in a tech company, if the market is growing rapidly, you're pretty likely to be successful as a startup company. Everything else could be a failure, right? The product might not work or the marketing might not be on point, but if the market as a whole is growing, you're in a good place. Drug development is the exact opposite. You need hundreds of different things to all go right and for the stars align for that drug to get to patients. But if any one of them, from the stability to the supply chain, the mechanism of action to the regulatory authority, doesn't work, then unfortunately the drug is not going to proceed. So I think that's the facet that I'd say is really critical for people to understand is the multifaceted team sport that goes into drug development, but also that you need everything to work at the same time. And you just generally don't get a drug to move forward if that doesn't happen.
Yeah, yeah. And that is probably not even that affected by novel technologies. Or would you say like that complex interplay where all pieces kind of have to work together has changed much over the last few, say, years or decades? Have we seen like a trend toward that getting even more complex, or is the complexity being alleviated by some factors?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Leah. I feel like you've got one component where you've got such new exciting technologies like gene therapies and ASOs and RNA medicines, etc. You've also got much better understanding of patients, right? Can we much better define genetically or otherwise the specific patient population that really suffers from a disease? But I think the process of drug development has probably become, I would argue, slightly more complex because we've now started to understand all of these different facets. And regulatory authorities, especially, tend to be more involved and also have created other challenges, right? Like the incentive structure, like the regulatory pathways to advancing these medicines. So I think it's always been complex. It's probably a little bit harder today than it was before. But I think there's hope, especially with initiatives like DSI and work we're doing on the clinical trial side or on trying to understand patients. I think there's potential there, but definitely a little bit more complicated than I think people would like and what really need it to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on a D side front rather, as I understand you, you were first a traditional C corp, but have since moved to a DAO model. What perceived advantages made you choose that transition?
Yeah, so for us, I think some of the challenges that exist as being based in the United States, we have a lot of regulatory kind of constraints as well as a lack of clarity around how these sorts of projects are really going to be viable, at least in the United States. I think in addition, with unfortunate challenges like FTX and the collapse of Luna, we've also seen a lot more cultural kind of pushback against crypto, unfortunately. But in our view, at the end of the day, what motivates our approach is first to say, what's really going to help us get more medicines to patients? And what are avenues by which we can do that in a scalable manner that still keeps patients at the center? And so one of the inspirations for our model came from the work that the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation did many decades ago when they funded some of the early drugs that now are the dominant pipeline for Vertex Pharmaceuticals, a $100 billion publicly traded biotech company based here in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we've seen is that independent of the corporate structure, if you kind of have patients as part of the mix, but also leveraging technology in the right ways to help guide both the decisions and the capital, I think you can end up in a really unique and disruptive place. So for us, just given the regulatory issues, we're kind of delaying kind of launching a token in the interim, but have started to really lean into the technology that we've built to help us identify the best possible drugs, keeping patients close to the best as partners to help identify and advance those medicines, but then also try and fund with external capital the right types of projects to be able to help get those medicines to patients.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps, next to many advantageous aspects of DSI, what maybe would be the currently most counterproductive shared belief within DSEC communities that you have encountered? What do you wish members would change their minds about?
Yeah. I think I'll actually maybe just challenge the premise of the question, which is one of the things I've found to be really exciting about the DeSci space is that there's very little dogma, right? Everyone comes to the table with an open mind, and I think that's what's drawn them to DeSci is that they believe there needs to be a new, better way of doing things. I've also found that the community as a whole just tends to be really non-judgmental, very supportive, and relishes the success of others. If you spend time in certain biotech circles, those things aren't necessarily true, for example. So I guess I'm reluctant to highlight, I guess I haven't really seen much that has highlighted a gap or a fault in the thinking
Mm.
of the community or the beliefs that are held. I think maybe if I was to highlight anything, I'd come back to the earlier comment I made around the team sport nature of drug development. I think a lot of the DSci perspective certainly comes from the academic environment and early stage biotech companies and early stage scientists. Very important, but that is one set of perspectives that need to be combined with a suite of other know-how like clinical development, regulatory, manufacturing. Those sets of expertise tend to be things that you can't necessarily source from an academic environment and usually requires a decade or two at least of experience in order to be able to do right in a compliant and safe way for patients. So I think those are just my core comment is that I've loved the openness and supportiveness of the community, but I do think because of its origins more in an academic setting, I do think there's an opportunity for us to start to bring in these more downstream sets of expertise that's required to truly advance a medicine as far as it can go.
On that note, are there any other common misunderstandings that the two factions that you seem to be interacting with on a regular basis, both academia and the private sector? Are there any other common misunderstandings that those two factions have of each other? What do you wish each one would realize about the other's world?
Yeah. I think the misunderstandings or maybe the lack of connectivity, if you will,
Mm.
I'd say falls into kind of two camps. The first, which is I think the most unfortunate, is the um, perception of interest and motivation on the other side of the table. So, and I'm just, these are not my opinions, these are just observations of what other people's opinions are. If you were to go talk to drug developers and you ask them what they think of sort of academicians who want to work in this space, you often get responses around how academics care more about publishing and grants and awards and a lot less about their science actually working in a patient. Um, Similarly, if you were to go talk to academicians about drug developers, you often hear kind of jokes about they're only profit motivated and only want to do things that are super low risk, right? There's probably some element of truth and observation that's led to those opinions over the past few decades, but I believe it to be too reductive of an articulation of either side. And I think those are one of the things that kind of hold us back a little bit from collaborating in the appropriate way. I think drug developers need to realize that actually a very large portion of academics actually want their science to actually go and help people, right? And actually, many of them don't are starting to see the challenges with the publish or perish mentality, and have developed an interest in whether it be spinouts or drugs in patients or things that advance intellectual property as other adjacent measures of the success of the work that they're doing. So that's one important thing to keep in mind. Similarly, I think academics also could benefit from recognizing that for drug developers, there's a very large number of them who also want to get medicines to patients and aren't actually motivated purely by the economics. I think we all realize that there has to be some economic component just to ensure sustainability and growth of the space. I don't think anyone's talking about disbanding with that entirely, but there's a measurable number of people in the drug development domain who care deeply about the patient and seeing their work go and help people. And that's why they do it day in, day out. I think the other part on the risk side, especially, is important to keep in mind is that when you're an academic, you only see one facet of a drug, right? The biology, how it works on a petri dish or an animal. As I alluded to earlier, that's just one thin slice of all the additional things that need to go right in order for a drug to actually get to patients. And so I think when we start to consider drug development, drug developers or pharma companies being risk averse, I do think it's important to have a little bit of empathy for the cost and the difficulty of aligning all those stars over time to actually get a medicine to patients, and the realities of the economic costs of doing that as well. So I'd say at the first level, when you ask the question of, you know, what are kind of the misconceptions and the disconnects, if you will, between those two parties, I'd sort of highlight around motivation as being one of the common disconnects that I've seen, because the people I've interacted with, I think, have a very common mission and goal and objective, just maybe come from different facets of the community.
Yeah. Within your own career, then, you did a PhD and were then, as I understand it, still working within science for a number of years before you actually branched out into the private sector. Is that right?
Yeah, so I did my undergrad at Cornell, a PhD at Northwestern with Sam Stoop, and worked closely with Fraser Stoddard as well, who won the Nobel Prize in 2016. And then came to Harvard, where I did my postdoc with George Whitesides, one of the
Mm-hmm.
founders of Genzyme, the big biotech
Mm-hmm.
company, and loved those experiences. I was very fortunate to spend time with phenomenal scientists who deeply loved the work that they were doing, and that came through every day you worked with them. But by chance as well as by kismet, I guess, ended up starting some of the early software companies focused on the pharmaceutical industry that to date now I guess have maybe a few hundred employees, raised over 100 million in venture, but most interestingly allowed me to take the knowledge and the passion I had for science, but translate it into at least software products that people kind of can use day in, day out to help them advance their science and their medicines.
Yeah, wonderful. If you had double the amount of funding, and in this context of the question, we can also talk about what Vibe is doing more specifically. But I'm curious. First of all, maybe you can introduce the details of the DAO, but then also, if you had double the amount of funding, which direction would you take Vibe into? Would that direction change with, say, 5 times the amount of funding? Basically, I'm wondering whether you would keep on doing the things that you're already doing, or whether there are like qualitative shifts, other issues that a great increase in capital would enable you to tackle.
Yeah. Um, it's hard to opine about what might be possible in the future, from a capital standpoint. What I'd say is that I've seen, from a founder standpoint especially, capital has it's a double-edged sword. I think you've highlighted the positive side, which is your ability to kind of go do things that you might not have been able to do previously because you have now more financial resource. But I think what also the past few years have shown is the reverse, which is also the other edge of that sword is you tend to lose focus and tend to dilute your efforts and end up not necessarily making as much progress as you wish you would have. And so I'd say on our side, I think we're doing the right things to focus on how our technology that we're building, and I'll share more in a bit, can help us identify the right types of medicines with the best chance of reaching patients and bringing capital to the table to actually fund the best projects there. That said, if there was more capital at the table, some of the things that I've started to see that are really interesting is to ask the question, in addition to focusing on just rare and overlooked diseases, could we focus in on other domains as well that require new types of thinking and new types of science? What's cardiovascular, neurodegenerative, longevity, right? Amongst others. The other thing that I think is personally interesting is to say that when you spend more time building technologies for pharma and actually now trying to fund and advance medicines, you start to identify more and more areas where technology could potentially help solve really critical problems. One of the problem statements I'll share with you and the audience here that I think is particularly important is that today, the vast majority of medicines that we advance, before they are tested in humans, are actually tested in animals. Generally speaking, that's for both ethical and safety reasons, right? You don't want to put something unknown into a human, and so you kind of test an animal first. The problem, however, is that imagine if you are a software developer and you are programming in an environment, your IDE was completely different than what your production environment is. The value, the variables, the resources, the libraries are completely different. The work you do on your desktop would be completely irrelevant and useless when you want to try and push to production. That's a huge waste of time and energy, especially when you think about the number of piece of software that's being written, number of lines of code, number of people that are out there. That's more or less exactly what we're doing today in drug development. We're taking a pseudo bad model, whether it's with mice or monkeys or dogs, that are not really representative of humans, either from a disease standpoint or a genetic standpoint, but using them as the test bed for drugs that are intended for humans. And so that's one example of a type of problem I'd love to be able to, in addition to go solve, if we had more capital at the table. Because I think having a more relevant set of models and views on what drugs will work in humans allows you to improve dramatically the drug development process and
Yeah.
identify drugs in a more systematic and safer manner as well.
Yeah. On the animal testing front, who is doing interesting work on trying to perhaps, change the model organism, come up with better ways that are still, maintaining an ethical standard, but also are just much more efficient and kind of uh, truer to human nature, perhaps? What are some interesting ideas, maybe even floating around, even those that haven't spun out into startups yet?
For sure. Some of the areas that we've seen development and investment to date are things like lab on a chip type work, where you're trying to grow these cells from different tissues on chips and sort of see how they interact with drugs. There's companies like Emulate, for instance, here in Boston, that kind of pioneered some of that work out of Harvard. There's a lot of folks who are doing organoids, especially in the case of cancer, to be able to more better simulate how drugs interact with those sort of tumors. We're seeing folks also try to develop new types of technologies to make animal testing more streamlined and data driven. So there's a company that Tim Robertson started a few years ago, and Joe Bethelacroix as well, called Viome, that built these really smart cages to kind of do that sort of measurements. So I think there's a lot of different thrusts out there in terms of things that are probably more on the cusp of drug development to date that is probably of note. It would be some of the work that folks like Arcadia Sciences are doing in trying to use organisms to help model different types of diseases. Second, I'd also highlight the folks at Perlara, who are doing really exciting N of 1 studies. So in Ethan's case, what they've been doing is partnering with patient communities to be able to take their genetic disease, program it into organisms like yeast as an initial test bed, and then take those medicines, assuming they're safe, and then try them in patients in N of 1 studies. So I think these are some really great examples of folks who are at the forefront with a completely different mindset and perspective, perhaps unencumbered by the history of drug development, who are able to find new ways to be able to test these in more patient-relevant circumstances. One of the ideas that I personally have been kicking around as well is to ask the question, when you look at the human body, it's so complex and so unique. It's hard to find a analogy, genetically or otherwise. And so one area that I've been kind of interested in is to actually look at patients who are decedent patients, namely those men and women who have opted to become organ donors. But it turns out that even after they are eligible of being an organ donor, about 90 to 95% of them can't actually donate their organs because they've taken a certain medicine or have other health issues that preclude them from being a donor. And so the question is, well, when you're donating your body to science, could we potentially enable them to uh, be participants in the drug development process and help their legacy kind of help advance medicines for patients that normally wouldn't have medicines in that case? So I think there's a lot of interesting things to be done in this broader space, but definitely requires a different perspective and kind of an unorthodox view on how the world works.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe to shift gears a little bit to focus on Vibe, and especially its focus on developing AI tools to also better aid drug development and discovery. Um, could you speak a little bit about how the implementation of AI tools for especially doing due diligence on therapeutics, um, how that how that looks like in a product perspective? Like, what are some examples of maybe companies that have used your tools and what they've done with them?
Yeah, absolutely. So, maybe taking a step back, let me maybe pose the circumstance and the scenario that I think a lot of listeners are probably going to appreciate. The first, in my view, is that when you look at a DAO, a DAO has a really important responsibility to allocate limited capital and funds to projects that are going to be not only aligned with the mission of the community, but also to hopefully be successful, get products to patients, but also maybe return some capital back to keep the mission going in perpetuity. I believe the most difficult challenge in that circumstance is picking the right projects and the right science and the right drugs to put those limited resources behind. That challenge that DAO communities face, I think, is in part because there is a lot of different pieces that need to go into a drug being correct and working, but also lots of that expertise might not sit within the community, it might be external.
Mm-hmm.
That same problem statement exists whether you're a pharmaceutical company allocating your internal R&D budget or a venture fund trying to allocate your LP dollars. And so I think that problem of picking really comes down to assessing the science and forecasting its success with as much accuracy as possible. So when we were establishing our DAO initially, what we found was that patients and scientists working together help you identify interesting science and important diseases to go solve. But again, because of both the different types of expertise required and the difficulty in developing a drug, as well as some of the biases that emerge, especially emotionally in that process when you're a patient, sometimes the best drugs aren't necessarily the ones that get picked. So we started to build out proprietary software that we want to use in order to help us automate, quantify, and in an unbiased way, understand the risks of a drug program and help us forecast its chances of moving down the drug development funnel to patients. So how that works practically is that we've built out software that you can essentially take a data room or data from scientific literature, filings, intellectual property, press releases, drop it in, and it can then automatically compute with an existing framework that we've developed and give you a sense of the risks related to all the critical facets of a drug program. Biology MOA, clinical development, CMC, regulatory, preclinical development, etc., etc. All of those individual facets in of themselves is very complex. And in total, there's hundreds of different parameters we're able to extract and analyze around that drug program to quantify the risk, and then use those risks to help us forecast whether that drug is going to be successful downstream. So for example, when we're actually evaluating projects to fund ourselves, we look at a company and ask the question, based on the risks that we're seeing, do we think this is going to move forward? If there's lots of risks around the clinical trial, lots of risks around the in vitro proof of concept, lots of risks around the model, then the chances are lower that it will be successful. In the converse, if we start to say that the industry has for some reason overlooked this specific drug or this disease area, but the science looks good, patients really need it, there's a clear path that you can manufacture it and test it in humans safely and easily, then that might be a diamond in the rough that we should be going and funding. I'll just maybe offer one additional analogy around kind of how we think about our software, which is if you're a crypto project, you're on a regular basis as a kind of a core member looking at the number of token holders, the token price, number of monthly active users, daily active users, transactions, fees generated, etc., right? These are all critical metrics that help define whether a project is successful or not. Those same metrics are what you use to understand its current value, but also project where it's going to be in the future. I argue that you can do the same thing for drug development, but it just is a much more complicated and domain-specific set of metrics, given the uniqueness of the science from disease to disease, modality to modality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe to initially just hone in on one of those points and what you aim to do with your AI tool in particular. When you say you want a bias-free, like unpartisan, look at the risk profile of a given project, how do you actually ensure that impartiality? How do you think about maybe bias within AI tools in particular?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think the next couple of years are going to start to show what AI bias really means versus human bias. I'll share with you the human bias first, which is, and you've probably seen this from the communities that you're a part of, but diseases that probably are less familiar, or scientists who might not be from prestigious institutions, or targets that might not be popular in the media tend to be areas that people shy away from because of that unexpected kind of unconscious bias. I think it's safe to say that we should be looking at all really good diseases that require treatment, as well as science that has merit based on the data, etc., than just reputation. In the case of AI, what we've started to see from other folks who kind of leverage it is to ask the question, what data is the model learning from when it makes its conclusions? And how is that data set biased in some degree or take you down a wrong path? So for some of the other approaches that we've seen out there, AI has been trained on, say, historical drug development failures and successes to inform whether a new drug being studied is going to work or not. I'll be honest, I actually have a fundamental qualm with that uh, mental model, in part because the reality is, unless you're doing an exact copy of the prior drug, the new drug you're studying should, in theory, be uncorrelated with the work that was done in the past, right? That's the whole point of doing something novel and new, is that it's unrelated to what was done in the past. So what's the virtue of using historical data in the context of predicting future outcomes when they're inherently uncorrelated? The other part I'd also prompt is to say, as we start to look at different diseases, there aren't a large number of data available for, say, successful drugs in ALS or successful drugs in Alzheimer's or in other areas, right? Arthritis. There's maybe a handful. And you and I both know from a statistical standpoint that you need measurable numbers of N in order to make true inferences in that regard. So that's my challenge and concern around kind of the historical view and how AI is currently used. Our view is very different. And so what we've figured out how to do is to say, we think humans, when you remove the bias, have a really good opportunity to bring their expertise to the table to help understand a specific drug program and its risks within their specific domain, like manufacturing or clinical trials, etc. What we figured out how to do is to take that thought process of the human, their expertise, and turn it into software, such that now we have an AI agent that can go and highlight the same risks, highlight the same rewards of a drug program within that domain with the same level of accuracy as a human would if they were to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
The difference is we no longer have the bias of not liking a target or the origin of the science, but instead can look at it from a first principles standpoint in an objective, data-driven way. So we're actually using AI to kind of make decisions like humans would, as opposed to make initially kind of forecasting based on historical data sets in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
It's all kind of within this common kind of technology umbrella, but it's a very different kind of implementation and use.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know how much you can speak to this because obviously it's a proprietary tool. I'm just curious whether the very training set, how constrained that was. If it's basically training the AI on multiple different, pretty specialized, as I would imagine, expert groups whose decision making process it then replicates. How did you go about that in as vague of terms as you need to speak about that?
No, happy to be as kind of open as possible on an audio only forum. But basically, the first thing I do want to comment on is that, given the mission here of us trying to help get more medicines to patients, we're actually actively working with other entities to enable them to leverage our tools for their own use cases. So it could be, we're very open to partnering with DAOs to help them with their diligence and scouting process for projects, pharmaceutical companies to help them think about pipeline prioritization and in-licensing, or even investment funds as they think about where to allocate their capital. Unlike other kind of schools of thought, I think the more people that can use the technology and benefit from it, the more medicines that will ultimately get to patients. And I think we'll all be able to win as a whole, as a community. So very much open to kind of enabling others to leverage our insights. Now, to answer your question specifically around training the model, we did a couple things. So the first is we actually sat with a group of drug development experts, and a very large number of them over time, and asked them to distill and break down any one of those about 9 or so disciplines into the core common sets of risks that constitute a diligence within that space.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, and we get very granular, let's take one like regulatory.
Mhm.
What's the regulatory pathway? How much time is it going to take? What's been the historical tenor of the conversations that the company has had with regulatory authorities around this approach? That's sort of one set of examples of risks that emerge when you start to ask those questions, which is what an expert would do when they look at a data set. So we try to eliminate bias initially by simply asking the question of what are the important questions that need to be understood independent of the drug or the disease that you're looking at. We then take those common insights that we've gleaned across drug developers and put that into the AI and enable the AI to ask those same questions. So once the AI has asked those questions, we then do two things. The first is we take a training set, not a training set, but rather an existing drug development data set, have the human group evaluate that science, and then have the software evaluate that science as well. And in circumstances, what we're looking for there is overlap in the conclusions that are being drawn across those two groups.
Mhm.
If we feel like the experts are finding the same sets of conclusions that the software is finding, then we know that the software is operating in a similar way as the experts. The other facet that we do is we actually try and rewind the clock and do back testing. We would look at a certain date, let's say 2010. What's the standard of care in wet AMD, an eye disease, for example? Now, knowing what the standard of care is, let's look at drugs that were in clinical trials in 2011, 2012, and 2013. Based on the data that we see around those drugs at that point in time, should those drugs have been approved or failed based on what we know up until that point? And if the outcomes that the software concludes align with the actual scientific outcomes and regulatory outcomes for those trials, then we also know that there's alignment. So unlike, again, a more big data kind of approach, what we're trying to do is actually take the decision-making process and adding rigor and systemization to it, and then evaluating its fidelity compared to sort of a human group of experts.
Yeah, that makes sense. What have you maybe changed your mind about, especially with relation to uh, maybe the limits of using AI for drug discovery since you started the project? What maybe
Mm-hmm.
have you learned? And we can also make this
Yeah.
question broader in terms of what you just change your mind about in general since starting a project.
Yeah, I think in the case of AI specifically, what I've sort of felt is that you still need to. So I think there's two things that AI will not be able to do well. The first is I don't think it's going to be very good at evaluating people and teams. And you've probably seen this with, whether it's DAOs or startups, right? The tenacity and the excitement of the founder and their passion and commitment to a project and a mission is one of the most important things in seeing that project be successful. I don't think AI is going to be able to give you a sense of that. It's really something that you have to have a sixth sense for. The second part I also think is that um, AI as a tool has to be a component of a much broader set of analysis around what you want to do. If you were to simply ask the question and pose to the AI to optimize for the lowest risk stuff, you'll probably end up doing purely generics or repurposed drugs, so they tend to have the fewest open
Mm-hmm.
questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's not what drug development's about. Drug
Yeah.
development's about helping patients in the most rigorous way possible. And it requires you to be comfortable taking certain types of risks. So I think what we're trying to do is enable AI to give you a much more transparent view as to what those risks are. If you have a new modality or something that's difficult to manufacture or an uncertain patient population, those risks might actually be okay. You shouldn't stop doing drug development for those reasons. You should just be transparent about what the implications are when you're advancing it. And if you have a portfolio, it's great to have a set of programs you're investing in that all are uncorrelated in terms of the risk that you have. So I think those are kind of the fast up one on the AI side. I think at large, again, as I highlighted, I've been really grateful for the receptivity and the openness and the support of the broader kind of crypto community. I think we're at this really unique inflection point from a DeSci perspective as to how our technology from a tokenization and blockchain standpoint is really going to affect this space. I think we're starting to see burgeoning areas like publications, DAOs and financing, data as well. And I think once we get sort of the first one or two kind of breakthroughs that can validate not only that the project community has longevity, but also that there's financial kind of flow of capital to ensure that it can grow over time. That's the
Mhm.
one piece that I'd say is going to really unlock a lot for the rest of us.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, I'd like to ask this question, and you could take it wherever you want. I guess to constrain it maybe to the just rare disease world in general, what do you feel like is the implicit knowledge that you feel like holds true generally, but it's not necessarily explicitly stated? What has to be learned anew through experience by everyone entering the field with no, to you, obvious reason? It could be written down, shared more publicly, but for some contingent reason or another, it just hasn't happened.
Hmm. Well, I'm trying to think about when I was first started working in this space back in 2021 and 2022. What did I learn then that really surprised me that now I kind of take as an assumption, right? Take for granted.
It's always a hard
Um,
one. It's like the curse of
yeah,
knowledge. You're starting to close to it.
100%, right? It's curse of knowledge, and also, yeah, um, knowing kind of not knowing what folks in the audience don't know about too, right? It's another piece. So, okay, maybe off the cuff, some of the initial areas I'd highlight as at the time unknown unknowns that now are sort of known knowns are first that rare disease drug programs have the highest success rates, but at the same time are also the most likely to be deprioritized for bad reasons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think when I was getting into this space, especially in my daughter's case, one of her diseases has about 80,000 patients in the US. That's quite a substantial number,
Mm-hmm.
and a decent market opportunity when you kind of sum up the costs as a result of that. However, despite that, um, diseases like those are deprioritized, one, because they're not commonly heard of, and two, because when an executive team has to make a tough call with a limited budget, they're going to choose the diseases that seemingly have a large market opportunity on the back end, um, even though it might already be competitive or their chances in their program might not be excellent in comparison to what's out there. So I'd say that's like one area that I didn't truly appreciate when I first got into this space. I thought
Yeah.
back of the envelope, all right, real market, lots of patients. I'm feeling it myself. I'm experiencing it myself, my daughter. We should have something in development. But the
Mm-hmm.
reality is that those sort of triaging discussions and decisions end up being unfavorable. I think the second part, and this probably is going to be a little more controversial, is that I don't think genomics by itself is going to solve all diseases. Um, I think genomics underpins a measurable number of diseases. About half of all rare diseases that we know of are defined by genomics. But there's a lot of other pieces as well that also impact disease, from physiology and anatomy to the proteomics, right, and RNA, components around RNA. I think there's a lot of pieces there that I think we have yet to explore, in part because there's exponentially more proteins in the body, right, than the genomes that you've got. So how do we think about sequencing and understanding those as well in real time? Um, yeah, and I think the other part that I'll highlight, this is very scientific, very niche, and this is not something I learned when I started doing Vibe, but when I learned when I actually came to Harvard, but makes sense intuitively, is that when you look at tools like AlphaFold or crystal structures of proteins especially, we have this assumption that they are this rigid, kind of highly crystallized structure, and we're trying to fit a drug into this specific pocket. That's not an incorrect way to think about it explicitly, but when you actually look at the body and how it actually manifests, the one piece that a crystal structure doesn't factor in is the solvent. Namely, the body is like 70% plus water. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that actually the protein is not one kind of fixed structure, but it's actually this dynamic, solubilized structure in the body that kind of forms a structure, deforms a structure dynamically over time. So this wasn't something I learned in doing Vibe, but kind of learned when I was a scientist, that I think the industry has yet to kind of truly grok when it comes to thinking about how we design drugs and
Mm-hmm.
ensure that they're an appropriate fit for a specific target. It's just the dynamic, solvated nature, unstructured nature of the protein itself.
Yeah. Are there other kind of metaphors that you feel like have entered the thinking of biopharma that really, if you're spending sufficient time, in a scientific context, uh, kind of just don't hold up, but are still, maybe surprisingly so, pretty
Oh my
much part
God.
and
Yeah.
parcel.
Oh, tons. Yeah, tons. So yeah, like one, rare is not going to make a lot of money, right?
Hmm.
Is one. Second, pharma should only go after big diseases with $2 billion plus in annualized sales. Is another one. I think especially on that latter point, if you look at the commercial projections for any drug that's gone to market, almost all of them, virtually all of them, were incorrect. And so what that tells you is that we are just really bad at estimating the true revenue potential of a drug. And the majority of time that it's wrong in that people overestimate the revenue because they want to justify their job and justify the launch and all the resources. But at the same time, in the cases where it was underestimated by a massive amount. And that's because biology has all these really interesting kind of interplays and interconnections. So if you're able to target a disease like atopic dermatitis, well, it turns out that there's some mechanisms in common with something like rheumatoid arthritis, right? As an example. So I think that's another piece of the equation that you really actually don't really know what the actual revenue potential of a drug is. Scientifically speaking, coming back to proteins, this is probably going to be very controversial. I'll probably get a bunch of hate mail for this, is that there's an assumption in academia especially that proteins have 3 layers of water solvated around them. And that's thus water structured to 3 kind of molecules beyond the structure of the protein surface. But one thing we learned at Harvard and kind of I think the literature holds up is that if you actually start to drill into the basic science of that, there actually isn't a lot of science that actually backs up that statement of the number of layers of water surrounding that solvates a protein. So I think there's tons of different facets of dogma within the industry that I think are ripe for disruption. Yeah, I could go on and on about that. And I think that's another kind of beauty of the DeSci movement is that you're to some extent unencumbered by a lot of that history and a lot of that dogma. I think the flip side is that there's probably still a lot that we still do need to learn and take advantage of, right, from a compliance and ethics and manufacturing standpoint, for example. But I would much rather start with a blank slate and learn from first principles than not.
Mm-hmm. I know we're running out of time slowly but surely. I do want to ask you in the end whether you can think of any important questions that I have not asked of you today. What don't I know that I don't know? What do you feel like is left unaddressed?
No, I think enjoy the conversation. I think we covered off a lot of key pieces. I think maybe instead of a question for this forum, I'd maybe leave the conversation with maybe some questions for the broader audience, which is first to ask the question, what is like the one disease or problem in the science space that you are personally most passionate about and that you feel you're uniquely convicted and also uniquely positioned to go tackle? One. Second, I'd also highlight is when you think about the complexity of science and drug development, how can we do a better job of coordinating amongst ourselves to be able to leverage the right expertise, the right know-how, the right tools to be able to do that? And then third, from a capital standpoint, how do we try and bring new sources of capital to the table to be able to make this a reality? Whether we like it or not, drug development costs money and it's expensive to different orders of magnitude depending on what you're trying to do. But the more capital we can bring to the table and the new types of sources of it, I think helps us unlock these sorts of ideas and these sorts of initiatives. So I'd pose that question, which is how do we bring kind of new types of capital to the table? If memory serves, to date, there's been about, let's call it 150 million or so put into DeSci to date. Very solid amount of capital, but or market cap. I have to check on that. It was market cap or capital, but yeah, how do we 10x that? Where's that going to come from? What kind of value can we create for those folks who are putting capital in as well? So I think that really boils down to me the framework that I think about DeSci, which is people, tools, and capital, right?
Mhm.
And I think those are the pieces that we can do uniquely well as a industry and as a domain, and have a unique opportunity to kind of change science and history as a result.
These are excellent questions to leave the audience with. Alok, thanks so much for taking your time today. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much.